Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We are getting ready to celebrate Reformation Sunday this coming Sunday. And so we're going to be focusing on the theme of salvation by grace through faith, a classic Reformation doctrine. And we're going to be using the lectionary reading from the Gospel of Luke for this Sunday, which is the story about Zacchaeus. So that's Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. Before we get there, though, I want to start with the first of the three P's. It's prayer. And this is a prayer for the church by Martin Luther King Jr. Lord, we thank you for your church, founded upon your word, that challenges us to do more than sing and pray, but go out and work as though the very answer to our prayers depended on us and not upon you. Help us to realize that humanity was created to shine like the stars and live on through all eternity. Keep us, we pray, in perfect peace. Help us to walk together, pray together, sing together, and live together until that day when all God's children will rejoice in one common band of humanity. Amen. It's a great prayer, right? Okay, the second of the three P's is perspective. As I always do, I try to bring in a fresh perspective to help fill out the Bible lesson that we're going to be looking at, or to give us another vantage point through which to interpret. So, this perspective for today comes from the performer Nick Cave. He just came out with a book along with Sean O'Hagan. Sean O'Hagan is a journalist, and the book is a series of questions and answers. So it's an extended interview between Sean O'Hagan and Nick Cave. And Nick Cave's answers to the questions are quite powerful. He gets into all kinds of things like grief, addiction, grace, faith, God, life, lots of topics. It's a powerful book. The title of the book is Faith, Hope, and Carnage, and it was just published this year. One of the best books I've read this year. So what I want to do is read an excerpt from the book, and this excerpt focuses on the connection between Narcotics Anonymous and faith. So he's got some interesting insights about faith from this. And a little background here, Nick Cave was a heroin addict for years and did several stints in rehab before it finally stuck. And in this interview with Sean O'Hagan, he links rehab with faith. So here's what he says. When I first got clean, I used to go to Narcotics Anonymous meetings. Essentially, you have a group of apparently hopeless drug addicts, many of whom may not have a spiritual bone in their body, who are being asked to hand their lives over to a higher power in order to get clean. Initially, many of them are reluctant to even consider doing that, which is a perfectly rational response. I mean, why should you surrender your life to something that you think doesn't exist? But they're told to just walk the walk, and many are desperate enough to follow the instructions. It's a life or death choice, after all. And so they hand their will and their lives over to something that may very well not exist. And in a great many instances, they get better. They get clean. Their lives greatly improve. Not only that, but what often happens is that many of them end up handing their lives over to a higher power as a matter of course. They find that believing in something that is true enough works throughout all aspects of their life. I guess what I'm saying is that the believing itself has a certain utility, a spiritual and healing benefit, regardless of the actual existence of God. God can be for them whatever they want God to be, as long as it's something more powerful than they are. It could be the group itself, for instance, but I think it's generally understood by most as some kind of divine power. Essentially, you are being asked to surrender and have faith. And if you are prepared to do that, you find that it works. So, for me personally, having a religious dimension in my life is highly beneficial. It makes me happier, it makes my relationships with people more agreeable, and it makes me a better writer. Because I think we're all suffering. And more often than not, this suffering is a hell of our own making. It is a state of being for which we are responsible. And I have personally needed to find some kind of deliverance from that. One way I do that is to try to lead a life that has moral and religious value, and to try to look at other people, all people, as if they are valuable. I believe our positive individual actions, our small acts of kindness, reverberate through the world in a way we will never know. I guess what I'm saying is we mean something. Our actions mean something. We are of value. Pretty cool, right? So, some themes that stand out for me from that excerpt, and again, that's Nick Cave speaking very personally about his own faith experience. So, a few things stand out for me. So, first, that faith can be born in moments of desperation when we've got nowhere else to turn. So, the example of the addict at Narcotics Anonymous moves in this direction. Then, secondly, faith is about entrusting ourselves and our very lives to something bigger and more powerful than us. And in that surrender, there is a kind of salvation. And then finally, we matter. We are of value. So this brings us now to the third of the three P's, which is the story about Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19. And this is a story about those three things: desperation, faith, and its relation to salvation, and then a tax collector finally realizing that he matters. Okay, Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." Okay. One of my favorite stories in the Bible. It's a story about grace and faith, and also a broader theme. It's also about salvation. Um, and these themes are traced throughout Luke's gospel. So this is not the only story that talks about these things and talks about a person being transformed. We see that throughout Luke's gospel, he has a kind of focus on those who are outcasts. So, right away in the Christmas story in Luke chapter 2, the first witnesses of the Christmas story are the shepherds. And shepherds in the ancient world was a pretty lowly form of employment. So, shepherds are the first witnesses of the Christmas story. So, Luke is highlighting the emphasis that will continue on throughout the gospel, which is that the outcasts matter. They certainly matter to Jesus. Then we see when Jesus is at a dinner party with a Pharisee, a woman who was a prostitute comes in and washes his feet, and Jesus shows her kindness. The parable of the Good Samaritan is another example of an outcast, the Samaritan, showing kindness to somebody who you would never expect him to show kindness to. And it's a story also about love and transformation. And then other parables, the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the prodigal son. These are all examples of a God showing grace to someone who is lost. In his book, Ragamuffin Gospel, Brennan Manning writes that in Luke, Jesus has a thing for outcasts, and Brennan Manning calls these outcasts ragamuffins. So here's what he writes. Jesus spent a disproportionate amount of time with people described in the Gospels as the poor, the blind, the lame, the lepers, the hungry, sinners, prostitutes, tax collectors, the persecuted, the downtrodden, the captives, those possessed by unclean spirits. all who labor and are heavy burdened, the rabble who know nothing of the law, the crowds, the little ones, the least, the last, the lost sheep. In short, Jesus hung out with ragamuffins. He also related with warmth and compassion to the middle and upper classes, not because of their family connections, financial clout, intelligence, or social register status, but because they too were God's children. One of the mysteries of the gospel tradition is this strange attraction of Jesus for the unattractive, this strange desire for the undesirable, this strange love for the unlovely. So, an example of one who is unlovely is Zacchaeus. We're told in today's story that he is a tax collector. And tax collectors in the ancient world, much like tax collectors today, were not well liked. But in the ancient world, they weren't well liked because of the system that the Romans used to collect taxes. It was a kind of tax farming system. So what they would do is they would hire local tax administrators. Zacchaeus may have been one of these. He's called a chief tax collector in the story. So they would hire these guys, and then the tax administrator would hire tax collectors to collect more than the fee the Romans charged. So this would ensure that the tax collectors got paid, the administrators got paid, and the Romans would get their taxes. So everybody would get paid. But basically, it was a system that incentivized exploitation. And the people actually doing the collecting would often be kind of thuggish about it to make sure that they got their money. So in verse 2, we're told that Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector, which implies that he's probably an administrator and he's the guy who's hiring the thugs to go out and collect the taxes. So we might imagine that this guy was not very well liked by the people, probably hated, in fact, by the people. He works for the Romans, he hires thugs to collect taxes, and he's gotten rich at the expense of others. And yet, what's interesting about this story is that Zacchaeus, even though he's wealthy, Luke calls him rich, he seems unsettled. So in verses 3 and 4 of the story, Zacchaeus is curious to get a closer look at Jesus, wants to know more about this guy. Maybe he's heard word about him already, but he wants to see him. So he tries to peer over the crowd, but he's unable to do so. So he climbs a tree. And Luke actually says he was short in stature, which is one of the reasons why he couldn't see over the crowd and had to climb the sycamore tree. The actual Greek word that Luke uses there is mikros. It's where we get our word micro from. So Zacchaeus is tiny. What's always interesting to me about this story is maybe that word, micro, isn't just talking about Zacchaeus' physical stature, but it's also a kind of metaphor to describe the life that he lives. It's actually a small life. Even though on the surface he seems successful, he has social connections through his other Roman administrators, he has wealth. It seems like he has everything pulled together. It seems like a large life. But in fact, something about him seems unsettled in this story. And maybe, in fact, he's living a small life. Maybe he is lonely, has no real authentic friends because all of his interactions are quid pro quo. He does something for somebody else and they pay him in return. And maybe Zacchaeus, like Nick Cave, was ready to cast himself onto a higher power. He was looking for something more in life. And along comes Jesus right up to the sycamore tree. So Jesus makes a point of going to talk to this person, even though there's a crowd around. And imagine this crowd. They all know who Zacchaeus is, and they probably hate him. And yet Jesus cuts through the crowd to go straight to Zacchaeus. And he treats him as a human being. Jesus doesn't care about his wealth. Jesus is not interested in his status, his success rate. He's not interested in any of that stuff. He is interested in Zacchaeus, the man. Zacchaeus, the human being. Zacchaeus, perhaps the lonely human being. Now, in verses 6 to 8, there is some ambiguity in the text, and it's worth highlighting. So let me reread these verses. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome Jesus. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." And then Jesus goes on to say that salvation has come to this house because he too is a child of Abraham. He too. Um, he always was, but it's almost like Jesus is reminding the crowd that this guy too is a child of God. Now, there is some ambiguity in verses 6 to 8. And the ambiguity is, did Jesus actually ever get to Zacchaeus's house? The language could certainly mean this. In verse 6, it says Zacchaeus was happy to welcome Jesus. And then in verse 7, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. It could imply that Jesus has now gotten to Zacchaeus's house. But verse 8 says Zacchaeus stood there. Where did he stand? Possibly he just stood there at the bottom of the tree while all of this is going on. They haven't even started in the direction toward his house yet. Now, it's not a huge difference between those two things. However, if they never actually left the tree site, Zacchaeus stood there, it could imply that just Jesus's willingness to go to Zacchaeus's house, even though it was unpopular, even though people are grumbling all around him, just his willingness to do it, just Jesus treating this person as a human being, and just his willingness to go to the man's house was enough to transform Zacchaeus's heart. It was enough to save him, we might say. So just the invitation alone, just treating him like a human being instead of as a hated tax collector, was enough to humanize him and make him feel loved and lovable. Make him feel like he mattered, to return again to what Nick Cave said in the excerpt that I read. And the effect on Zacchaeus of Jesus treating him this way is immediate. He gives away all his money, not all of it, but he gives away a chunk of his money. He promises to pay back 4 times anyone who he's defrauded. He basically becomes the town philanthropist after meeting Jesus. Jesus awoke inside Zacchaeus that divine spark that lives inside all of us. And why? Because Jesus didn't judge him. Jesus didn't shun him like many others probably did. Jesus treated him as a human being, as a son of Abraham, a child of God, as someone beloved and worthy of grace. And the divine spark inside the man was kindled. He surrendered to this grace. He entrusted himself to it, and it transformed his life. So this coming Sunday, again, is Reformation Sunday, and it's about remembering one of the key ideas that came out of the Reformation, which is that we are saved by grace through faith. So when we experience grace and acceptance, like the kind of grace and acceptance that Jesus showed to Zacchaeus, that spark of faith that lives inside all of us can be kindled. And then our lives too can be transformed.